kids, it's Miss Beth, and I'm going to tell you guys a Bible story. I love telling stories, and Bible stories are my favorite because they point us to God and they help us learn about Him. So for the next couple weeks, I'm going to be telling you guys the story of Exodus. But in order to understand what's happening, we have to go back into Genesis and figure out what was going on that made the events of Exodus happen. So, we had Abraham, and God gave him a promised land and promised him a kid. And he had Isaac as his kid, and then Isaac had two kids, Jacob and Esau. And our story continues through Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. Wow, that's a lot. And his favorite son was his 11th son. Joseph was his favorite. And Joseph's older brothers didn't really like that Joseph was the favorite, so they captured him and sold him into slavery. And Joseph was sent to Egypt. And through some different events, some good, some bad, Joseph became second in command of all of Egypt. There was Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt, and then there was Joseph right underneath him. And so Joseph was in charge of pretty much everything, and only Pharaoh could tell him what to do. And God let Joseph know that there was a famine coming. And so Joseph helped Egypt to store up all this food. So when the famine came, they were going to have enough food. So the famine comes. There's not enough food. There's no food growing. And so, but they've got all this food stored up. So Egypt is doing pretty good. Well, here's Joseph's family back in Canaan, and they're like, we're out of food. We don't have any food. We're getting kind of hungry. We hear Egypt's got a lot of food. So Jacob, Joseph's father, sends the 10 brothers, he kept the youngest home, he sent the 10 brothers to Egypt to see if they could buy some food. And they go to Joseph, and they don't recognize him because it's been years at this point. They don't recognize him, and they're like, hey, we need some food. Well, a whole bunch of things happen. Pretty much Joseph's whole family ends up moving to Egypt because of this famine so that Joseph can take care of them and make sure they have food there. Well, Joseph dies, things happen, time passes, and Joseph's family, his brothers and their wives, and they have kids, and they have kids, and they have kids, and they turn into this huge group of people. And there's been new pharaohs, and the new pharaohs looking, going, there's a lot of those Hebrews. They would call them Hebrews or Israelites or Jews, all the same people group. And they said, there's a lot of Hebrews. And they kind of worry me because there's a lot of them. What if they decided to join our enemies and take us over? So the Pharaoh, the king, decided, let's turn them all into slaves. So he turned all of the Hebrews into slaves. And they were there in Egypt for 400 years. As slaves. And they grew into this huge nation of like 2 million people. But they were slaves. And they wanted to go back to their promised land, and they were stuck there. And so they prayed to God, and they said, God, help us. Save us from being slaves. And God had a plan to save them. But there were sad things happening. Pharaoh was looking, the newest Pharaoh, was looking at these 2 million people. They were slaves, but there were so many of them. And he's like, gosh, there's a lot of them. We got to find a way to stop them from having more kids. So he decided that anytime a baby boy was born, the baby boy would be killed so that they wouldn't have as many people. And that was really sad. And there was a lady, and she had a baby. And she didn't want to kill her baby because she loved her baby, so she hid him. And after 3 months, she was able to hide him for 3 months, and after 3 months, she knew she couldn't hide him anymore. So she made a basket, and she lined it with pitch, which kind of makes it waterproof so that it can float. It's a little tiny boat. And she put the baby in the basket, and it says she put it in the reeds at the river. And she had her daughter watch the baby in the basket. And then it says the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter, came down to the river to bathe. So I'm guessing she purposely put the baby in the basket near where she knew the princess was going to come. Just to see, hey, maybe, just maybe, this Egyptian princess will save my baby. Well, the princess sees the basket, sees the baby, and says, "Oh, it's one of those Hebrew children." She recognized it. She knew from the beginning that this was one of those Hebrew children. It wasn't an Egyptian baby. And Moses' sister was really brave, and she came up to the princess and she said, "Do you want me to find a Hebrew woman to take care of the baby for you?" And so the princess gave her back her brother, and she took her brother home to his mom, and his mom took care of him. And when he was big enough, they took him back to the palace, and the princess adopted him and made him her son. And she named him Moses, which means taken out of the river. And Moses grew up as an Egyptian prince. And we'll talk next time about what that might have looked like growing up as an Egyptian prince. But what I want to talk about is, what can we learn from this story? We learn that God protects us. So Joseph's family was starving. There wasn't any food. And even though his brothers had sold Joseph to Egypt as a slave, God used that to store up all this food, to provide and protect Joseph's family. And he moved them there, and he protected them, and he gave them the food he needed. And then when Moses needed to be protected from being killed, they put him in the river by Pharaoh's daughter, by this Egyptian princess, and she protected him. And it reminds me of when Jesus was born. When Jesus was born, they were in Bethlehem in Israel. And Herod found out about that. Herod was king of the area at the time. And he was kind of crazy and was really, really jealous. And he didn't want anybody else to be king because he heard there was a new king. And he didn't want anybody else to be king. They would take his job. And he didn't like that. So he ordered all the baby boys under 2 in Bethlehem to get killed. And Mary and Joseph ran away to Egypt to keep Jesus safe. So we have Joseph in Egypt providing food for his family, the Pharaoh's daughter in Egypt saving baby Moses, and Egypt being the safe place for Jesus to hide while Herod was trying to kill him. And it's just all these times that God protected his people, that he had plans for, that he was going to work through to create his story, to tell his story, and to save his people from their sin, to save the world from our sin problem. He protected them. And I love how God protects us. So that's our story. Come back next week and I'll tell you what happens to Moses next as he is growing up in Egypt. Take care. Bye.